Hi, this is Adam Wolf, physical therapist. I wanted to talk a little bit about hip impingement and some of the strategies that I use when I'm working with people that demonstrate that pathology. And so if we're going to think about what the hip is, again, we sort of know it's a ball and socket, and we've got that ball, the roll and glide that we all sort of know a little bit about. I don't want to get too much into that. If you are curious about the specifics on the specific osteo and arthrokinematics at the hip joint, that ball and socket, I recommend you go read it elsewhere. But what I did want to talk about is how I deal with that a little bit, and some of the things that I find with people that demonstrate that femoral acetabular impingement, or front of the butt pinch is what I like to think about it as. And if we think about the joint is space between bones, on a larger scale, what we never want is closing angle pinch. And what I mean by that, if we're thinking about my elbow is a joint, it's space between these two bones. When my elbow bends, my bicep side is the closing angle side, my tricep side is the opening angle side. And so that rule of when I'm bending, I would expect to feel the stretch or sensation on the opening side of a joint, not on the closing. And so time that to places away from the hip. When I look up, I should feel that on the front of my neck, not the back. When I go to the right, I should feel it on the left side, not the closing angle side on the right here. And so if I'm flexing my shoulder, I should feel it here, not here. External rotation, I should feel it in the front, not the back. And so these rules sort of hold true anywhere in the body. When I'm flexing my hip up and I feel this in the front of my hip and not the back of my hip, that's considered closing angle pinch. Dr. Andrea Ospina from the Functional Range Conditioning talked a lot about closing angle pinch and the fact that it was bad. I always sort of knew that. He really hammered that home for me, the fact that if we have that closing angle sensation, what it is indicative of a capsular limitation a lot of times. It's just the deep connective tissue around the heads of the bones is too tight. That's what I think about. And the way I explain it to my patients a lot of times is around the heads of the bones is like saran wrap that sort of wraps the heads of the bones and keeps them in place together. What happens a lot of times is that saran wrap is too tight, and when that saran wrap is too tight, the roll and glide of one bone and how it should spin on the other, you sort of lose that ability. And so then when you go to flex your arm, and there should be a spin of the joint, the spin of the head of the bone as it's moving in the joint, it's not able to spin, and it glides and sort of pinches in the front. And that's pretty much what happens mechanically at the joint is when there's an impingement or that closing angle restriction, a lot of times the joint loses its spin and increases in its glide or translation. So the joint loses its rotation and it increases in translation. And clinically, that's something that I've found that holds true pretty much across any joint that's not really moving or has that closing angle pinch. And so that needs to be cleared out first. If we have that closing angle pinch and I bend up into this and I feel this in the front, not the back, it's not a good thing to bend farther into it and up into this position, because it's just going to pinch it more and sort of piss off the tissue, is how I explain it to my patients. So we want to avoid that. It's not a stretch. It's not a hip flexor stretch, is the way that I've heard it referred to sometimes. We're going to talk about some strategies to clear that out, and we all have our tools that we want to work with joints. I like to use a lot of isometric contractions as I'm working around joints, sort of place them to the point of limitation and then isometrically contract the long muscles and the short muscles. It's what functional range conditioning refers to as progressive angular isometric loads and regressive angular isometric loads. And for more information on that, I highly suggest you check out FRC. But basically the way I equate that to people that have experience clinically is it's instead of a contract-relax, it's a contract-contract. And so that's a great strategy to be able to work around the joint. Whatever trick you have in your bag, improving joint mobility has to be strategy number one. If we have that impingement, that closing angle restriction, we're going to clear that. Then we're going to clear out the one joint muscles, followed by the two joint muscles. That's always sort of the rule of how we're going to work. We're going to release the capsule first. We're going to release the one joint muscles, then the two joint muscles. And so just a couple of strategies, let's say, and the course of what we're going to talk about here are the exercises and movements that I like when people demonstrate that impingement, particularly surrounding the hip. And so one of the assessments that I like to use is a controlled articular rotation from a functional range conditioning. And so if I'm standing, what I'm going to do is isometrically pack some air into my gut. I'm going to irradiate that contraction. We all know Sherrington's law of irradiation. If you don't, you should go look it up, but that's about basic neurological principles. It's a way to amplify a contraction really well and synergize a contraction. Okay, so I'm going to pack some air in my gut. I'm going to synergize that contraction. And then the idea is to move only one joint at a time. And if I don't have joint independence, I'm going to be interdependent on the way the joint joint moves. And so before I even laying them on the table, if they have the ability to do this, I'm going to. So I'm going to pack them. Obviously, if there's pain, I'm going to move around. I'm not going to do this if there's pain, but I'm going to pack some air in my gut, squeeze. I'm going to flex my hip up. Here's my closing angle pinch on my hip here. I'm going to take the joint through all of its range of motion. I'm going to bring it out. I don't want to rotate through my pelvis. I want to keep straight ahead. Here's the transverse plane. I'm going to extend in the sagittal plane and bring it back around. And then I'm going to switch sides here, or reverse it, I guess, is the way. And the idea is to have joint independence. Otherwise, I'm going to have joint interdependence. I'm going to be needing to move through all of my joints to get the movement, as opposed to being able to move through one joint. And so this is my actually bum hip. I have a torn labrum on that side. I'm going to show you, though, that this is my hypermobile side, and it's evident. You'll see it on the camera there. I'm going to do the same thing on my left side, which is my side that I don't have enough motion in. Remember, the site of the injury, not the cause of the injury most times. So this is the side that doesn't move enough. When I bring it up, here's as far as I can go before I start to get restriction, and you can see the side bending that occurs as I do this. And so obviously there's some difference one side to the other that I work on, but if I experience closing angle pinching through a lot of this, I need to back out of that, okay? And I'm going to only go within a range that I can control and that's pain-free. So when I'm coming out to the side, I should feel this here, not here. When I'm lifting, I should feel it here, not here. When I start to feel it here, that's closing angle. I'm not going to go as far. So one regression there, I can just simply hold onto a wall in either position. I can be here, I can be here, I can use this arm with my right. So there's any combination that I can use, but just if I need a little bit of stability here, this might be a strategy that I use to do that, is to hold onto a wall, okay? One regression from there, we can just drop it down the ground. If they aren't able to do that, and I'm trying to teach them to get some of that glute movement, what I'm going to do is perhaps regress them a little bit. I'm going to show you the first regression and then the second regression. I typically start with the second regression. What I'm going to do is bring this down to the ground here. And so I'm going to get into a quadruped position, hands over my, right under my shoulders, knees slightly wider than my shoulders, knees slightly in front of my hips as I'm here. And what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to pack some air in my gut. I'm going to irradiate that contraction. I'm squeezing my whole body. I'm bringing my hip up into flexion, pee on the tree, lift my foot into the middle and down, and then I reverse that out to the side. Some of the compensations that I'll see is sort of flexion in their back, okay? Bending into their elbow as they do this in side bending. So really want to try to keep it in a range that the only thing that's moving is that hip, okay? What I've experienced for people that have impingements in general, particularly around the hips and the shoulders, is they are not able to move a lot of times from their spine, they're not able to move from their extremities without moving their spine. And so when I flex my shoulder up, if I don't have the range, what I'll do is sort of move through my spine in any number of ways to sort of get the motion, okay? When I flex up my hip, if I can't get it pure, a lot of times I'll sort of round into my low back, and so I'm not independent in the hip motion, I'm interdependent on other regions of the body. Those are just some of the things that I see clinically with people that have these impingements. So if somebody had that hip impingement, a CAR is a great way to start as an analysis. And for me, as Gary Gray says, the test is the exercise is the test. I can very easily make that evaluation of a CAR or that hip motion into an exercise, and it's something that I do often. This would be the first regression. If I saw a lot of spinal movement as we were doing this, I would probably regress it down to the ground to sort of give them the sensation and start to really find some of that hip independent motion. So I'd like to do it to be a prone CAR is what I call it. This prone CAR is probably my go-to also as a side note for really being able to engage your glutes if I'm going to try to do that. And so from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay flat on the ground here. And when I'm laying flat on the ground, if I'm using my right hip, I'm going to rest my hands on my head, or my head on my hands facing to the right. I'm going to bring my hip up to the side here. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift my foot to the ceiling, squeeze some air into my gut, squeeze the contraction, lift my knee, and bring it back to the middle and back down. And I'd repeat that. I'd bring it out to the side, lift my foot, squeeze my body, lift my knee, back to the middle and down. If I can't lift my knee from here, what I'll do is just squeeze and just pull my knee back in. Eventually you'll be able to lift your knee up. Okay, some of the compensations that I see, one of them is when I'm up to here, the pelvis starts to come up, so there's some rotation. So this will be the first one. Okay, so I only want to come up as high as, I bring my knee up to the side until my ASIS starts to come up off, and then I want to keep it anchored in there. Once that's there, the second compensation that I'll see, if they can't get this motion in their foot up, what they'll do is side bend into their low back. You can see I sort of side bend. So I want to keep it, if I'm too high, see I can't get my foot up over my knee, but if I bring my knee lower, I have more motion. So it's all about getting the motion. Now, don't go too far into a position where you can't get the motion. It's the motion that we're going for to turn on proprioceptors, to give some feeling of what joints feel. Okay, so again, it looks like this. The third compensation, this could all be really good. This is all good. When I squeeze, what I'll see a lot of times, as I lift my right knee up off the ground, my left elbow will come up also. So as I'm lifting, I'd squeeze. You'll see a lot of this type of thing, which tells me that again, there's some opportunity for improvement. I think about that posterior X. Maybe that left lat is really sort of upregulated or potentially helping out. Anything on that left side. So I might want to check that on a motor control level. So when I'm here, I'm going to coach them to squeeze, keep the left elbow on the ground as I bring my foot up into the middle and back down. So that's one that I'll regress as we're working for the hips. One more that I'll do from that as well. I'll show you here in just 1 second. I'm going to grab a ball. So pause that. All right, so I'm back here with my ball. It's nice, something for the cross ball. Now, personally, on a side note, I don't love to do a lot of self-release for people with the cross balls. I feel it's too smashy and too much compression. I like a little bit of applying the principles of tensegrity where I can compress and tension at the same time. So for me, the cross ball I don't love to rub on. Most times I like tennis balls, just on a side note. But what I will do with the ball is get in this position, and again, we're trying to move from our joints without moving from our spine. And so if I start to do this position where I start to dump into my back, I want to teach people to not do that, and I'm going to take the ball and put it right at about my sacral base, right at the top of my sacrum. Roundel forward, just keeping it right in that position. A few different homework assignments or movements from here. One is just to give them the sensation I'm not engaging anything, I'm just here, and I'm, again, hands under shoulders, hips wider, knees slightly wider than hips with my knees slightly in front of my hips, and then I'm just going to work on sitting back, and I want to make sure that the ball doesn't move. You can see that as I move back, I should be able to get roughly about to my pelvis to my hips or my knees, so my pelvis to my ankles when I'm in this position, and then come on back nice and slow. This is teaching me, even though a lot of people feel like I'm getting an anterior tilt here, this is really like a neutral position and very much like squatting. So these people that we work with that impinge in the front when they squat, most times they're dumping into their low back. And so this is one strategy that I've used to be able to teach people to do that. Okay, and what you'll see is people will start to dump or roll, and the ball will roll out if they get the butt wink. Okay, so that's one that I like with the ball. A second one that I like in this position is start to teach people to engage their core when they're squatting or have that hip impingement, same exact position, hands under shoulders, knees in front of hips, slightly wide. I'm going to pull my hands into my knees and my knees into my hands. And that, when I do that, that isometrically engages sort of everything, particularly right in through here. When I pull hands to knees, knees to hands, I'm just going to hold this position for 4 seconds. I like 4 seconds because I want people to hold and breathe at the same time. And once I have this for 4, then I'm going to start moving my hips back, still pulling hands to knees, knees to hands. I'm engaging sort of my whole core. Hold it, and I'm going to drop back for 4. I'm going to hold it at the back for 4, still pulling hands to knees, knees to hands. At the bottom of that, for a count of 4, I'm going to bring it back up to the top for a count of 4. I like to go slow because we have to breathe and move and engage at the same time. People that have back pain or impingements in joints have difficulty, in my experience, engaging their core, breathing and moving, one or the other, or work 2 and not 1. They miss it. But all 3 are really important. So this is a great strategy to start to be able to do that. From there, once they get that, I combine them. I take the ball from this position right here. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull. I'm engaging my core now, revved it up. I'm going to start moving with the ball here to start to give me those sensations. So that's a 3-step process that most people that have impingements in either their hips or their shoulders, I'm going to use with them to go through. I'm going a little faster. I go a little slower. 4, hold it at the bottom, and then bring it back up. So these are some that I like a lot, teaching people to start to move independently in their joint rather than interdependent in their joints. Another thing that I like to do for people that have hip impingements particularly is isometric work, especially if they've had a chronic hip impingement. Pain science shows that if you have a chronic hip impingement, or a chronic pain in general, quite frankly, on a larger scale, that you're going to lose representation in your somatosensory cortex to the painful region. So for me, I have a painful right hip, and that as it starts to get pinchy, if I do too much, this routine has really worked well. What we're going to do is isometric engage these muscles around the joint. Isometrics are a great thing because one, they're not inflammatory to the system, so it's a great way to start to introduce movement and introduce engaging the nervous system a little bit more from a little bit less of a threatening place. It's also a great way to build that somatosensory space in addition to strength. So one of the things that I'll do is just I'll hold isometric from various positions, particularly for me and my glutes and glute med complex, max complex. So just some simple exercises, and this is something that I've really come to appreciate kind of quite recently. But if you've got that chronic pinch, whether sometimes, and if they're not strong, or for me, when I started, I wouldn't even use a band, but I'll just get into these positions, and I'm just going to hold this isometric position with my butt back. I'm engaging my glute med right now. I'm literally just going to hold this position in one position for like a minute. And then from here, I would switch sides. You'll be surprised how fatiguing this will get after a minute on each side. So after if I was a minute here, I'd go to the other side, even though it's my right hip. If I'm in this position here and I'm engaging and I pull up, my right glute med and glute complex in general is pushing hard for me to stabilize here, let alone in the brain when one part of the brain fires. We can build both sides of the brain. That's what some of the studies show. So I would hold this, I'd go through, I'd probably start it without the band for 2 or 3 minutes, alternating 1 minute on each side for 2 to 3 on each side. I'll build to 3 or 4. From there, alternating, I'd add this. This is the next progression, just a straight leg raise. Just trying to build some representation for in my somatosensory cortex. And I'd hold this for a minute, and then I'd switch sides again over here for a minute. And I would hold this position. I'm up to like 7 or 8 minutes right now. I'll do like 3 minutes of the butterfly, 3 minutes of straight leg raise. I'm quivering by the end as I do this, but it's a great way to really build some space here. And then the third progression that I use from a regressed, in the more regressed positions, is just that same fire hydrant, sort of that car where I'm just going to stay real square. I'm going to get that leg up. I've got a little bit of abduction, got a little bit of internal rotation here, so my glute complex is firing, and I'd hold this for a minute, and then I'd switch sides a minute at a time, roughly. That's the stuff that I do from the ground. I'm going to go ahead and stand up here and show you some of the ones that I do standing. So from this position, really nicely, I can start to isometrically engage my glute complex. This is a little bit more higher level, but I'm still isometric here. I'm engaging. I can start to drive this leg in different positions. I can start to drive my hands in different positions. I can start to, do any number of things to start to engage these glutes. So this would be the next progression from an isometric standpoint, trying to build cortical space and build representation in order to strengthen more and improve the spin in the joint. When we feel that pinching again, it's a glide, not a spin. And so these exercises have been really good. After my hip is a little pinchy, when I go through these and then I go through this sequence that I've shown you, my hip feels like $1,000,000. A lot of times afterwards, it's a lot less pinchy. So try it. For those that have a hip impingement that respond to traction or long axis distraction in the joint, one of the things that I like to do with a super band is decompress the hip. This is not something that I do with everyone in my clinic, because some people, from a motor control perspective, when you distract a joint, the muscle becomes down-regulated, or the tissue around the joint can become down-regulated. Sometimes, we don't know unless we check. Sometimes when we distract the joint, the tissue becomes more connected and more up-regulated, which is what we want. So I would muscle test this, and that's probably a whole other conversation here. But for those that respond to distraction, and it could be as simple as testing a muscle, can it engage or not? Is it yes or no? Distract, retest, does it get stronger or weaker? If it gets stronger, I might choose to then distract the hip. Sometimes you compress the joint, just a little compression, and you retest and the muscle gets stronger, and you distract and it gets weaker. This would not be something that I would do. If they respond to compression, when I'm testing a muscle, I would then just strengthen all the muscles around the hip, even if it's an impinged hip. We work on improving the motion at the hip, but without distracting it and strengthening all the muscles. But for those that respond to traction, I test the muscle, I distract it, I retest and they get stronger or more connected, and I compress and they get weaker. What I'll do is have them purchase one of these bands. At home, what I'm going to have them do is tie a knot in one side of this, and then what they're going to do is just shut it under their door. Most people have a wood door or wooden floors that they can shut it, or the space in the door to shut this, and now here's the anchor. I'm going to use the cage here. And so a sequence that I like to do, just simply when my hip is real pinchy, I'm going to put my foot into here, and I'm going to take the outside band and wrap it around so it's back on the outside, and the inside band and wrap it around and put it back on the inside. So I've got a double wrap right here. I'm just going to go ahead and take a ton of tension in the band, and I'm just going to sort of hang out here and let my hip just sort of distract. It feels really nice. I can go on different angles. I could sort of get some of the proximal adductors, and a lot of times those people that have femoral acetabular impingement in the front, they're going to have really tight and upregulated adductors, so that's something to check. So this can sort of get some stretch. I'll go in different positions and just sort of hang out. As long as I'm feeling that length out, that sort of decompression, I hold this until my foot goes numb. That's when I hold it, and then I take it off. Sometimes at home, one of your feet will sort of come out from it, and that's why you still have a double wrap to be able to get that. So that's one sequence. The second piece of this, if they respond to that, what I'll do is I'll put the band all the way up at their hip and sort of create like a mulligan, I think about. And so almost exactly the one we did with the ball here, where we're going to create some tension in the band. Right now the head of the band is pulling my femoral head down and back into the joint, and I'm just going to work on sitting back until I feel a dump or I feel a pinch, and then I'm going to bring it back. So working on sort of getting some spin in the joint, not the glide. When you feel that pinch, what happens is it stops spinning and it begins to translate, and that's when it impinges. So a little bit of other ways to get this kind of into here and just sort of move around. I want a lot of tension in the band. So again, just some strategies that have worked for me and the people that I work with for when they have that femoral acetabular impingement or binding in the front of the hip. Hopefully this was helpful for you when I showed you some of the strategies that I use to improve the mobility and just ability of that hip to move independently without creating that pinch. Remember, that pinch is not a good thing. Future sessions here, I'll show you some of the on-table, off-weight-bearing ways that I look at the hip and work with the hip. I mentioned when we were distracting the hip out that some people respond to compression better than distraction, and some people respond to distraction better than compression. That is a very important piece of information for me and really directs me in my course of treatment. So please let me know of any questions you have. Again, Adam Wolf, thanks.